Hello, and today we're going to be reviewing the ryobi PBLRS02B 18-volt brushless reciprocating saw. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first up we have the, battery slot. And for the most part, it's an acceptable performance. There's definitely more play or looseness than I personally would like to see. But, you know, it is what it is. I haven't had any issues with the battery falling out or getting caught on anything or the motor stopping. So, you know, it works well enough. And of course, since this is an HP reciprocating saw, it does have the added contacts to make full use of an edge battery or an HP battery. So if you are planning on using this particular tool as full potential, you will need either HP or HP edge batteries. You can use a standard ryobi battery in this particular tool, but you're definitely not going to get the increased performance out of one of those batteries versus an HP battery or the even more upgraded edge battery. So for me personally, I think just the regular HP batteries are going to work just fine, and from my experience, the edge batteries just don't really provide all that much of an improvement over the speed and definitely seem to deplete their energy much quicker. So for me personally, I'm just going to keep using HP batteries with this particular saw, and I'm going to save the edge battery for my miter saw. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the front and rear grip. Starting off with the front grip, there is quite a bit of real estate and it's a fairly comfortable rubberized texture that does a fairly decent job at isolating your hands from the vibration of the motor. Not perfect, you can still feel the motor, but you know, you're never going to get away from feeling the motor on a reciprocating saw. But I'm pretty happy with the overall feel of this particular saw's forward grip, and I think it's a vast improvement over the previous generation's forward grip. Now when it comes to the rear grip, you're definitely going to feel a little bit more vibration on the rear grip because it doesn't have that floating effect that the forward grip has. But for the most part, it's still a fairly good performance, and if you're wearing a pair of work gloves, this tool is more than easy enough to handle, and I don't really have any long-term or, you know, long day fatigue after holding this tool, and my hands don't feel like they're going to vibrate off after a long period of time using this particular saw if I'm wearing work gloves with it. So for the most part, I think the forward and rear grip on this particular tool are acceptable. There's plenty of rubberized texture just about anywhere you can put your hand in order to hold onto the saw, and I definitely think that the overall design of the forward and rear grip is an improvement over the previous generation's, you know, ergonomics. So I'm fairly happy with the overall feel of this particular tool, and I think it's definitely a good upgrade, at least when it comes to the ergonomics over the previous generation ergonomics. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the trigger and safety. Now, starting off with the safety, it's a good design. Unlike on certain reciprocating saws that have safeties where you have to constantly press them to one side in order for you to pull the trigger, this has a simple push to one side and the safety's off, push to the other side and the safety's on. So, you know, it's the good kind of safety. And for the most part, I don't really have any complaints. You know, it seems to be out of the way. I haven't had any issues bumping into it. There is a little bit of looseness or play to speak of, but I haven't had any issues with it turning its own safety on or off. So, you know, for the most part, it's an acceptable design. I wish it was a little bit more recessed so that there's less of a chance that it could get bumped in a bag of tools if you choose not to take your battery out of your tool for when you're transporting it. But that's a really a minor complaint, and honestly, you know, I always take the batteries out of my tools when I'm transporting them, so, you know, it's not really that big of a deal. So, you know, for the most part, the safety on this particular saw is perfectly acceptable. Okay, next up we have the trigger, and it's not a great showing. Unfortunately, I do not have any audio on any of these clips because of my camera not recording the audio, even though the audio was coming through on the headphones, and on the gauge on the camera it said it was recording the audio, but it didn't, so that's something else I have to figure out. But when it comes to the trigger on this particular reciprocating saw, it's just not a great performance. Unfortunately, there's not very many speeds at the low end. It's hard to achieve those speeds at the low end. When you pull the trigger and it goes up in the different speeds, there's parts where it goes up slowly, there's parts where it goes up sharply, there's parts where it goes up, you know, instantly. It's just not a great designed trigger. Unfortunately, this does seem to be something ryobi does fairly often, although they have had certain tools where they've had good triggers. But on this particular reciprocating saw, it's definitely a bargain hunter trigger, and you know, it's not going to be that big of a deal for a lot of people. You know, most people are going to be using this reciprocating saw at full speed, and there is a lot of full speed on this particular reciprocating saw, meaning it does have a very fast stroke speed. But unfortunately, if you're somebody that needs to have a more precise, you know, speed control on their reciprocating saw, and you want to have slower speeds for delicate or more sensitive cuts, this definitely is not going to be your best choice. I think there are definitely far better reciprocating saws out there on the market that have much better triggers and have slower speeds on their motor. So, you know, this particular reciprocating saw is going to be okay for somebody who doesn't care about, you know, control over the speeds. If you're just somebody that just pulls the trigger back all the way on each and every try because you're doing demolition work, you know, it's going to be just fine for you. But if you're somebody that is doing precise cuts and you need to have some control over the accuracy and you need to be more precise and you need to slower speeds, this just isn't going to be the best saw for you. So just keep that in mind. And with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, and next up we have a nice upgrade over the previous generation's no rafter hook, the rafter hook. And quite frankly, this can come in handy, especially if you're working in tall places or just need to hang up the saw if you have limited, well, workspace. And this is something I do find to be somewhat useful. I definitely think this is a nice design, and quite frankly, I wish that, you know, Ryobi had implemented this sooner. But, you know, we have it now, and it is a nice upgrade. It has basically 3 different positions. The close position, where it lays flat against the tool, an upward position, where it lays, well, it doesn't really lay, it stands up completely straight, and then a side position, where it's basically, you know, 90 degrees to the body of the tool. So, you know, you have 2 usable positions, and, well, the close position. And, you know, I think that's good enough. It seems to do a fairly good job, and the only thing I might change would to be make, well, the hook a little bit deeper, but, you know, it's functional as is. So, you know, it's a decent design. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the blade release lever and the blade clamp. And quite frankly, I think it's definitely an improvement over the previous generation's blade clamp release lever and blade clamp. For the most part, there wasn't too much of an issue in the previous generation's blade clamp release lever, but I definitely think that this is a much thicker and much more of a durable design. It appears that there's much more reinforcement that's gone on here, and I personally like the rotating blade clamp design better than the previous generation's flip-up style. I just think it's a better design, and I personally love this particular blade clamp release on my rigid saw. I don't think that this is necessarily the best design. I think the on blade or the on rod blade clamp release lever, like on their one-handed reciprocating saw that Ryobi released, you know, last year, I think that's the better design. But I think that this is still an acceptable design, and I definitely think it's an improvement over the previous generation's design. Now, I know that there's been some reviews out there that have talked about things breaking and stuff, but I personally have not experienced that myself, and I'm wondering if they just ended up with 2 bad reciprocating saws from a bad batch. For this particular reciprocating saw, I've cut up quite a few pallets with it at this point, and I haven't had any issues with the blade lever or the blade rod becoming misaligned with the lever, and everything has been completely functional and works just fine. So I'm fairly happy with the performance that I'm getting from it, and I don't think that there's much of a, you know, I don't think there's a better way of doing this other than putting the blade release lever directly on the blade clamp. And I haven't had this particular saw drop any blades at all, so, you know, I think that it's been completely acceptable in its, you know, performance, and so it gets a pass for me. And I definitely think it's a worthwhile upgrade from the previous generation's design. So, you know, this was an improvement here. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the LED light, and while I am grateful that there is an LED light on this particular reciprocating saw, it is a downgrade from the previous generation. Unfortunately, they decided to go with a single LED bead, which means that there's more shadows, and it's also a bit dimmer than the previous generation's 2 LED beads. So, you know, while it is bright enough to work with, it's not as bright as it was on the previous generation, and there's more shadows. So, you know, this is definitely a bit of a downgrade, and I'm a little bit disappointed to see that Ryobi decided to, you know, cheap out on their lights on yet another tool line. I'm still mad about the tri-beam illumination going away from the impact drivers, but, you know, I know how to hold a grudge, unfortunately, for Ryobi. So, you know, Ryobi, you know, do better. Moving on. Okay, next up, well, actually last up, we have the shoe, and it's pretty limiting. It's not going to be that big of a deal because honestly there doesn't need to be that many positions that the shoe needs to be in, but there really isn't much of a range of motion here, and it's also not depth adjustable, which is definitely a major down, you know, side of this particular tool. Ever since I used the rigid saw that has the depth adjustable shoe, I pretty much want all my reciprocating saws to have a depth adjustable shoe because it can save you money on reciprocating blades, and quite frankly it just is a very useful feature to have. So I was very disappointed to find out that this particular saw wasn't going to be having a, well, depth adjustable shoe. So, you know, the shoe on this one is stiff at first. It will loosen up over time, but I definitely think it could have benefited from having the depth adjustable shoe that the rigid saw has. So, you know, A little bit disappointing here, but not the end of the world. But like I said earlier, come on Ryobi, give us some better features other than just a rafter hook. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, without a battery, but with a blade, the tool weighs 3,039 grams, which is going to be about 6.6 pounds. And with a 4 amp hour edge battery, it comes out to be about 3,719 or 20 grams, depending on what the scale is doing, which is going to be about 8.1 pounds. So, you know, it's not the lightest reciprocating saw, but it's not too bad either. Okay, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this particular reciprocating saw in use. And I have to say, I do think it is an improvement over the previous generation reciprocating saw from Ryobi in their HP lineup. For one thing, I definitely think that this particular reciprocating saw is producing more constant torque. I don't think this particular saw bogs down as easily, and I think it has more power to get through a cut. That could be the edge battery, but I was also noticing a difference with the standard HP battery, and no difference whatsoever with the regular battery. You need HP batteries with this particular reciprocating saw, whether that's HP edge or regular HP, it doesn't matter too much. Of course, the edge battery is going to cut faster, but you're also going to use up your battery much quicker. So, you know, it really just comes down to the saw's own performance when you're using either one of those batteries, and I definitely think that this particular saw is producing more consistent torque. Now, when it comes to just the overall comfortability of using this particular saw, I definitely like the grip on this saw a little bit better than the previous generation. I like that the previous generation had a little bit of a narrower you know, section at the end, but it also made it rather uncomfortable to hold, and I just think that this particular saw is just more comfortable to hold, and well, it's also better looking. But you know, appearance points don't really mean much in the real world, and when it comes to the overall comfortable grip on this particular saw, I definitely think it's more comfortable to use over long periods of time. Now, when it comes to just the overall, you know, new features we got, well, I do like the improved blade clamp. I think that's good, and the rafter hook is definitely a useful improvement, but I am disappointed to see that we didn't get an orbital function, which would have been very helpful, and I'm also very disappointed to see that we did not get the adjustable shoe, which is definitely the improvement I was looking for that we did not get. The adjustable shoe can save you money on, you know, blades, because you can just go to a new section of the blade if the one particular section gets worn down, and since we did not get that, well, this definitely isn't going to be replacing my rigid reciprocating saw anytime soon. So, you know, for pros and cons, this particular reciprocating saw is definitely an improvement over the previous generation Ryobi reciprocating saw, but I don't necessarily think it's that big of an improvement that you should run out and buy the saw immediately if you already have the HP regular reciprocating saw. Unless you have one of the first copies of the regular HP reciprocating saw, then I would probably recommend upgrading, because the first few, you know, batch runs of the first Ryobi HP reciprocating saw were just bad, and I think that this is definitely a vast improvement over those particular runs. So when it comes to this particular reciprocating saw, it definitely is an improvement, but it definitely doesn't have all the features that some of the competition offer. So, you know, it is what it is. With that being said, let's go ahead and recap with the pros and cons. Okay, and the first pro would be the better blade release. I know some people have had issues with this new blade release, but for me personally, I have not had any issues, and it's definitely a vast improvement over the previous generation's flip-up style. So in my opinion, this is a pro. And the next pro would be the rafter hook. The rafter hook allows you to hang this tool up effortlessly in several different locations, and is incredibly useful for if you're working on top of a ladder, or if you're just in a location that doesn't have any flat surfaces that are free of clutter. So in my opinion, this is a pro. Better grip. Overall, I do like the grip on this new saw better than the previous generation's grip, which was a little bit less comfortable to hold on to. So in my opinion, this is a pro. More powerful. Overall, this reciprocating saw definitely appears to have more torque than the previous generation saw, and does not get bogged down as easily. So in my opinion, this is definitely a pro. LED light. Yes, I know I said that it's worse than the previous generation, and it is, but at least it has one. Having an LED light on a reciprocating saw can be incredibly useful in a lot of different circumstances, and I'm still grateful that there is an LED light and it didn't go away completely. So, you know, it's still a pro. And the first con would be that there's no shoe adjustment. Unfortunately, Ryobi decided to skimp out and not give us shoe adjustment, so in my opinion, this is a major downside. So, you know, next time, give a shoe adjustment, Ryobi. Moving on. And the next con is that there's no orbital mode. That rigid reciprocating saw really spoiled me, and so I am also missing the fact that there is no orbital mode. The orbital mode can help you cut through things quicker, although it usually is a rougher cut. But in my opinion, sometimes it's worth it, especially if you're not working on something that you need to be super delicate with. So in the future, I hope we get an orbital mode as well. And the next con would be the trigger. Unfortunately, it's just not a very precise trigger, and they definitely could have done a better job with it. So, in my opinion, the trigger on this particular reciprocating saw could use improvements, and it is a bit of a con. And the last con would be the price. Unfortunately, this reciprocating saw is coming in at $140, which is fairly expensive. And when you compare it against something that's only $30 more, the rigid reciprocating saw, which features the adjustable shoe and orbital function, this just isn't that good of a deal. If it's around holiday time, maybe, but you know, unless it's bundled with something at a lower price, yeah, the price is just not that great, so it's a con. Okay, and that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular reciprocating saw. Overall, I like this particular reciprocating saw. I like the way it feels, I like that it has more power, I like that it doesn't get bogged down as easily, and I also like the fact that, you know, it's just a decent all-around saw. I'm not a big fan of the price tag. I think it's a little bit overpriced, and I definitely think that it's missing some modern day features such as an adjustable shoe or an orbital mode. You know, the orbital mode I could see having to pay a little bit more for, but the adjustable shoe really isn't anything all that special, and it's something that they could implement very easily. So unfortunately, this particular reciprocating saw is definitely lacking some modern conveniences that other brands offer now. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's a good saw. It gets the job done. It's better than the previous generation, so it is an upgrade. I wouldn't necessarily run out and buy this particular saw if I already own the HP saw, but if I don't own an HP saw and I already have a couple HP batteries, it might be something worth looking into. But the only way I would buy this particular reciprocating saw is if I could find a good deal on one used, or if it's during the holidays and they're offering some sort of battery bundle special with it. And then I think it's a much more, you know, appealing you know, item to look at. So this particular reciprocating saw does come recommended if you can find it at a better price than its, you know, normal retail price. So yeah. With that being said, thank you for watching this video, and if you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we will see you all next time. God bless.